everyone. Happy Monday. I hope you're doing well. We are going to continue our discussion of Unit 10, the post-war era. And today's focus is President Harding and President Coolidge. So in the election of 1920, Warren G. Harding is able to get the Republican nomination and he wins the election. And he wins the election because he's laid back and he really didn't have very many strong convictions. And coming off of 8 years of Woodrow Wilson, who was nothing but strong convictions, think about him traveling around the country trying to gain Senate approval for the League of Nations and making the world safe for democracy in the 14 points. Harding was much more laid back than that. And he was elected on his term that he made up, the return to normalcy. Probably meant normality, but he said normalcy, so now that is a word, I guess. He was hardworking. He was politically very shrewd and could see through people's motives and things like that. But he was non-confrontational, he was indecisive, and he really wasn't willing to offend people. One good thing that Harding did was he appointed able and reputable men to major cabinet posts. So Herbert Hoover, who helped the country not have to go to a rationing system during World War I with like gasless Sundays and meatless Mondays. Charles Evans Hughes, who was a Supreme Court justice. The people that he chose to be in his cabinet, many of them made up for his deficiency. Some of the lesser offices that he appointed men to, and a couple of major ones, went to his Ohio cronies, and he wound up appointing some corrupt officials because he felt a personal sense of obligation to them, either because they were old friends or because they shared his love for liquor and poker. And so we'll look at some of the Harding scandals associated with these people that he chose to be in several offices that he was appointing for. So during Harding's presidency, he was very much controlled by the Republican Party, or the GOP. That stands for Grand Old Party. He was pro-business, and the men who controlled him were pro-business. And so he promoted laissez-faire capitalism, that hands-off approach to government and to the economy. One of the best evidences of this is he actually gets to appoint 4 of the 9 Supreme Court justices during his presidency. This is one of the more significant powers that a president has, to appoint Supreme Court justices. If one dies or retires or is dismissed from their position, the president actually gets to appoint a Supreme Court justice. That's powerful because if he gets to appoint a couple of them, then they will interpret the law according to that political party, most likely. And so he actually got to appoint 4 justices who were Republicans. So in the interest of business, under Harding's presidency or during Harding's presidency, the court actually overturned a child labor law. And they also reversed a ruling in Mueller versus Oregon, which they ended up invalidating a minimum wage law for women. He also allowed corporations to expand. The antitrust laws that were in place, like the Sherman antitrust law, were not as enforced, and many of them were just downright ignored. Okay, so one of the men that wound up controlling the Harding presidency was actually the Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Mellon, and he came to dominate domestic policy. Domestic just referring to at home. Foreign policy is our policy regarding us and other nations. Domestic policy looks at our stuff at home. And so what he wound up doing was, number one, he lowered taxes on the rich. That's a very business-like mindset thing to do. He put high tariffs in place so that he could make it so that imports were more expensive and people would buy domestic goods. He balanced the budget, which is another kind of a conservative thing to do. He reduced the national debt by about $500 million a year. And even the Interstate Commerce Commission, which was supposed to control the railroad and control big business, he put people in charge of the Interstate Commerce Commission who were sympathetic to the railroads. And so this is a very conservative presidency in that he was on the side of business, not necessarily on the side of the average American. All right, so some of the Harding scandals. So Harding himself was personally honest, but because he appointed these people, his cronies called the Ohio Gang, his presidency had a bunch of scandals. Okay, so one of them was the guy he appointed to be Attorney General, General Daugherty, was an influence peddler. And so what this means is that he used his influence in the government and his connections with people and authority to gain favors or preferential treatment. And when he was discovered, he actually committed suicide in 1923. And then another one of these scandals happened to the director of the Veterans Bureau, Charles Forbes, and he actually siphoned millions of dollars for the construction of hospitals into his own pockets. And so when he was found out, he actually fled to Europe and his assistant committed suicide. And once this thing was said and done, he and his accomplices were found to have looted the government for about $200 million. All right, so Harding actually dies suddenly while in office. The story goes that his wife was reading the Saturday Evening Post to him, and she was reading an article that he was interested in, and he said, "That's good, go on." And then right after that, he just like shook for a second and dropped dead in his bed. He thought he had food poisoning because he had like cramps and indigestion and shortness of breath, but it actually turned out to be something that was fatal. I don't know what it was. So anyway, Vice President Calvin Coolidge takes over, and Calvin Coolidge was really shy, and he was known for delivering really boring speeches. The good thing about Calvin Coolidge was that he had no connection with any type of scandal. He was a moral guy, kind of like a Woodrow Wilson type, not as idealistic, but he in no way was associated with scandal. Like Harding, and typical of the GOP at this time, he had a pro-business philosophy that made conservatives happy. And so Harding actually died right before the next election. And so Calvin easily gains the nomination, the Republican nomination, and wins the election of 1924, mainly because the Democratic Party was really divided. So he wins in 1924. Okay, so the peace movement. So Americans really did want world peace, but not enough to join the League of Nations because they really didn't want to surrender any of their sovereignty to the League of Nations. But we did, as a nation, really want to avoid foreign entanglements after World War I. So this became like the era of peace. We went back to that Washington mindset, like in his farewell address, where he told us to avoid entangling alliances. And so these peace societies became really popular during this time. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, there was a Woodrow Wilson Foundation, and both of those flourished. There was actually a guy named Edward Bok, who was the editor of the Ladies' Home Journal, who in 1923 offered a prize of $100,000 for anyone who could come up with a workable solution for international peace. All of this actually culminates in the Kellogg-Briand Pact. This was signed in 1928 by 15 nations, and the pact renounced, quote, war as an instrument of national policy. And basically this meant that these 15 nations agreed to work out their problems diplomatically and not use war in order to solve problems. So under Herbert Hoover, not only did we treat these Latin American nations with respect as neighbors, but we also even treated them as equals. Then the Clark Memorandum, this one was signed in 1930, and this took the right of intervention in Latin American affairs away from the Roosevelt Corollary. And so according to Clark, the United States' right to intervene depended on the doctrine of self-preservation. So if we didn't have any self-preservation interests in Latin America, then we didn't have the right to intervene. All right, so we only remained isolationist for a few years before this was challenged in 1931. So in 1931, Japan occupies Manchuria, which is north of China, and in doing so, they violated both the Nine-Power Treaty and the Kellogg-Briand Pact. They were one of the nations that signed the Kellogg-Briand Pact, saying that war is not an instrument of national policy. And so China is nervous about that, of course, and they appealed to the United States and to the League of Nations for help, but neither did intervene at that time. The United States did, however, announce the Stimson Doctrine, which said that the United States would never recognize the legality of a territory seized in violation of American treaty rights. So they didn't agree to help China fight Japan or anything like that, but they did basically issue this statement to Japan saying, we do not recognize your right to Manchuria. And so really that didn't do anything except for irritate the Japanese. So after that, in the very next year, January of 1932, Japan attacked Shanghai. And this was just, they didn't even really target military bases or anything like that. This was just indiscriminate bombings of residential areas. So just killing people in their homes. And so the League of Nations, they don't really have a military, so they can't do much, but they did condemn these actions of the Japanese. And so in response to that, the Japanese withdraw from the League of Nations. All right, so looking at debts and reparations after World War I. One of the things that made the allies of World War I and what would be the allies in World War II ineffective in dealing with Japan's aggression is that they were arguing and quarreling over debt repayment and reparations. The United States during World War I had pretty much become the creditor to the world. We loaned money to various countries and we wanted to be repaid. and the Allies could not pay us back, and they owed us about $10 billion for money that we owed them during World War One. And so the Allies basically said, you need to write that off as war debt and just, forgive the debt altogether. And when we made it clear that that wasn't going to happen, they added the cost of it to German reparation payments. The problem is Germany can't pay that either. They were not in a position to pay huge sums of money for the reparations that were being asked of them. And so the Dawes Plan of 1924 was enacted by Charles Dawes to try to help address the debt repayment issue. And so what it did was that it set up German reparations and allowed for Americans to make private loans to Germany. So it's kind of cyclical the way this money is going. So we loaned Germany money, and then they would use the loan to pay their reparations to the Allies, mainly Britain and France, and then Britain and France would give us the money back to pay off their World War I debts to us. And so, like I said, this was very cyclical. And a downturn in the global economy was getting ready to happen at this point. And the United States never even received fully its war repayments from Europe. All right, we're done. I hope you have a great day. Don't forget to send me a picture of your notes.